Well, the tension over Ukraine is being seen as one of the biggest challenges to relations between NATO and the West since the end of the Cold War. Some analysts have likened recent events to those that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So how significant a moment is this? Well, let's talk now to Shea, who's the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Thanks so much indeed for talking to us today. So you, of course, had a long career with NATO. Could failure to reach an agreement on Ukraine be the end of the organisation?
No, not at all, because Ukraine is not a member state of NATO. So NATO's credibility in terms of implementing its Article 5 collective security guarantee to its members isn't being tested, of course, in the case of Ukraine. But Ukraine's an important partner to NATO, and it's a democratic country. And so obviously NATO has a strong interest in making sure that Ukraine is free from aggression, remains a democracy, and continues to be able to chart its own course in European security. So I don't see this crisis as an existential threat to NATO, but it's certainly another sort of turn of the screw in ramping up the tension between NATO and Russia, which has very much characterized the European security scene since March 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea.
Both sides, though, have said that the other's position is basically a non-starter. So how can something where positions are so entrenched be resolved?
Well, that's what diplomats are paid to do. And it's good that obviously NATO and Russia are talking to each other today. As Winston Churchill famously said, jaw is better than war. This is the first meeting of the NATO Russia Council since July 2019. So as you could imagine, after such a long period of estrangement and not talking, the first meeting, that sort of breaks the ice is inevitably going to be a meeting where Russia states its position and then NATO states its position. I think the meeting serves for NATO a good purpose. Number one, to demonstrate to Russia that it's not just the United States that is opposing Russia's encroachments on Ukraine, but it's the whole of NATO. All of 30 allies are strongly united. That sends a very clear deterrent signal to Moscow. But I think the second good thing about the meeting is that it also shows that the United States is not trying to cut a deal with Russia over the heads of the NATO member states. All of them have an interest in this debate, and therefore the fact that they're all meeting together shows that the United States is consulting its allies very closely. But the good thing, as your reporter just said, is that the NATO Secretary General has indicated that there can be follow-up meetings, and with the follow-up meetings I would expect we would get more into the nitty-gritty of how we can de-escalate the situation. For example, the type of arms control and confidence building measures to avoid incidents that the NATO Secretary General has just outlined.
Well, he also said, though, that there was the possible risk of a new armed conflict in Europe. How likely is that?
Well, nobody really knows what's going on inside the head of Mr. Putin. And paradoxically, the current Russian regime is far less transparent and far less subject to sort of any kind of checks and balances than the old Soviet Union, where at least you had, the Politburo, you had the Central Committee. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was reined in by his own people. So we are dealing, unfortunately, with a far less predictable Russia. And Putin has demonstrated on numerous occasions in the past, in attacking Georgia in 2008, in attacking Ukraine twice, annexing the Crimea, going into the Donbass, sending forces this week to Kazakhstan, that he's fully ready to use the military instrument where he sees fit. But nonetheless, I think this time round, the West has made it clear that this would come at an enormous cost to Russia in terms of all kinds of very strong economic sanctions. Ukraine also is in a much better position today with 250,000 troops and a defense budget which has quadrupled over the last 5 years. Ukraine is in a much better position to put up serious resistance. So this would not be a walkover by any means for Russia. And therefore, I hope that what is happening is that Putin is posturing, using military force, or at least a threat, to try to wring more concessions out of Ukraine, particularly regarding the Donbass. But at the end of the day, we'll find a diplomatic solution to this crisis. But again, with somebody like Putin, that will only probably buy us time until the next crisis.
Shea, great to get your thoughts today. Thanks for joining us on the programme.
Thank you for the invitation.